All right, let me ask you a question in starting in today's message. How many of you carry a pocket knife? All right, pretty regular. Okay, I'm seeing a number of hands. I don't know. If the hands are any indication, it's maybe only 15-20% of the hands in this room went up. People that know me and know me well know that it's a very rare day I don't have a pocket knife in my pocket. I mean, I always carry pocket knives. I've been doing that for as long as I can remember. Now, I will say this, I kind of get made fun of sometimes on Sundays because of the pocket knives that I carry. This is my pocket knife that I carry with me. I've got 3 or 4 Sunday knives. See, mine are categorized, and this is an example of a Sunday knife. Now, any other day of the week, it's a larger pocket knife that I'm carrying with me, but Sunday knives are always shorter. And so the blade on that is probably 1 inch long. And for some reason, we kind of have a cluster of people back in that corner that sometimes, you come walking in. I mean, this is like, man, this would scare people away. People come walking in, and they're back there comparing knives with one another. And any time that they're saying, well, what have you got? And I pull my knife out, they chuckle. But see, they only ask me on Sunday. They need to come and ask me on Monday for my pocket knife. So anyway, one of them felt sorry for me a while back, and I think he was kind of embarrassed for me. And so he wanted to give me a pocket knife that I could impress all my friends with. And so this is the pocket knife that I received. Yeah, this is some pocket knife. It takes some work getting it open too, but there you go. There's the blade on this thing. But I know it was heartfelt, the gift, because this is quality material, because it says it's engraved right on it, nice clear stamp. It says Pakistan. So that's the pocket knife that was given me. It's actually got 3 blades to it, but I can count on one hand the number of times I've actually carried that in my pocket. Well, the reason that I bring this up is that in today's text that I'm going to be reading in just a moment, in fact, this is the text right here, John chapter 18, starting in verse 1. In today's text, Jesus instructed one of his disciples to put his pocket knife away. And that's really what is playing out here. He's just telling one of the guys in his group, he's just saying, come on, put that pocket knife away. And we're going to see it within its context, and we're going to have a better understanding of this passage, perhaps a better understanding than we've ever had before. So if you got your Bible, open it up to John chapter 18, and I'm going to read the verses that are represented in that reference that's on the screen. John chapter 18, starting in verse 1, going down to verse 12, says this. After Jesus had said these things, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas took a company of soldiers and some temple police from the chief priests and the Pharisees and came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen to him, went out and said to them, "Who is it you are looking for?" "Jesus the Nazarene," they answered. "I am he," Jesus told them. Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing with them. When he had said, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, "Who is it you're looking for?" "Jesus the Nazarene," they said. "I told you I am he," Jesus replied. "So if you're looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the words he had said, "I have not lost one of those that you have given me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it. He struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. At that time, Jesus said to Peter, "Sheathe your sword. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me?" Now, a thing about Peter's knife here, that pretty much all scholars are in agreement on this, that the knife, or the translation, and most translations are worded this way, the word sword, using the word sword. Don't think of a sword as in one of these swords, that they would pull out and fight with, like the musketeers or whatever. Don't think of something that has that kind of length to it. Now, I can pretty much guarantee you it didn't have this length to it, okay? But the reality of the matter is it probably did. This knife that I opened up just a moment ago, it did have that kind of length. It was more like a dagger, except it would have been sharp on both edges. It wouldn't have been a folding knife. It would have been a solid knife, and thus the sheath. But it would have been a knife that had been more along that line, which Peter was a fisherman. That's where he had grown up. That had been his livelihood for as long as he can remember. And he was a guy that worked with his hands all the time, and he was used to carrying a knife around, and it was probably just a habit that he had continued to do. So this is what he had on his person at the time. And that's what Jesus is specifically referencing to on this occasion when Judas led this mob in and they arrested Jesus. Now, I could see what happened. This is all happening really late at night. And I can see it right now. The very next morning, the early edition of the Jerusalem Post, would have been leading with the headlines, "Jesus arrested." That would have been a recognizable name for a lot of people in the crowd. Maybe not everyone, but a lot of people, because Jesus had pretty much made a name for himself over the preceding 3 years. What with not just his teachings, but his miracles and all of this. And it wasn't the first time that some of the authorities had tried to get their hands on Jesus, but they had been unsuccessful in doing that. But on this occasion, they finally accomplished it. And so, I think in a manner of speaking, this would have made the headlines. I'm not sure the newspaper article would give these details, but if you had been privy to what was going on behind the scenes, you would have been aware of the fact that this all began with a conspiracy. The religious leaders and the political leaders had conspired together to get rid of Jesus. They had made that decision sometime earlier, but they were having a really difficult time accomplishing that. It was because Jesus' immense popularity, it kept getting in the way. However, a stunning development had just come to pass not too much earlier, and that is one of Jesus' own, one of his inner circle, had come to these authorities and was basically volunteering to betray Jesus. Yeah, I'm talking about Judas Iscariot. So now they had that angle working in their favor. Now, in this passage, John is wanting us to realize something as this whole chain of events is being set into motion, because as soon as this arrest takes place, boy, everything's going to accelerate. A whole chain of events is going to play out. But John, in the passage that I just read, he's wanting to make it very clear in our minds something that we need to have a good understanding about, and that is that Jesus is going into all of this the entire way. He's going into all of this with his eyes wide open. None of this is catching him off guard. I remember an incident that happened in my life, as close as my memory can nail it down on a calendar. I would say it was probably 1976. I was a teenager back in those days, and it was not too long after basketball season was over. So it was pretty cool weather, so it probably was close to being this time of year. Me and two of my buddies, we decided, it was a weekend night. It was either a Friday or a Saturday night, and we decided that what we were going to do is jump in the car and we were going to go to town, which town for us was Topeka. We're going to go to town. One of us had heard word, one of the guys I was with, had heard word about a community center in North Topeka that kind of had open doors. People can come into this gym and they could play basketball into the late hours of the night. It's just a way of getting kids off the street and keeping them from doing things they shouldn't be doing. And so the three of us, we thought, let's go in there and let's school some of the city boys at basketball. Yeah, that's my friend's attitude. I didn't have that kind of an issue going on, but no, I mean, seriously, here I was a teen. I mean, from the time I was 8th grade, I was 6'2", you know. I was skinny as a rail, and I remember I was still skinny as a rail at the time that this happened. But I went, my friend was 6'1", and the other guy, he was quite a bit shorter. But we went in there, we you know, came with shorts, or gym shorts and tennis shoes and all this, and we fully intended we were going to come in and we were going to teach these boys a few things in there, playing basketball. And we walked in, and it was one of these gyms that you would expect in a community center thing. Of course, it had the goals on the ends, but it also had a couple goals on either side. So there was a total of about 6 different goals, basketball goals. And there was activity going on at every one of them. We saw one of them, though, that only had 2 guys that were just shooting around. They weren't really playing a game or anything. And so we gravitated over to where those 2 guys were and just, you know, struck up a short conversation and then started shooting some hoops with them. And before you know it, they called a buddy over, and so we were having a little competition, 3-on-3. And I really honestly don't remember how that activity was going. We were certainly holding our own, but I don't know if anyone was really ahead of anyone else. But we were in the middle of that particular game, and it was about that time a guy come walking in the gym from the other end. And I happened to glance over that way, and I saw him, and there was something about him that triggered a memory, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And we continued playing the game, and as he was getting closer, I looked again, and sure enough, I recognized him. He was a guy that I had had a couple of run-ins with a couple of years earlier. He was from one of our rival schools that certain individuals in here grew up in, Rossville, Kansas. And there was a couple of things that had happened a couple of years earlier, so that you could say there was some bad blood between he and I. And he recognized me too, and he wouldn't you know, pay the respect to call me by my first name or anything. He'd just shout out Fangman, and he started shouting out Fangman. He said, "Fangman, I want to play you one-on-one." You know, and I mean, it interrupted our game, obviously, but the closest goals nearest got interrupted as well. And the thing about him is, over the 2 years, I really hadn't changed much. You know, I hadn't started sculpting this physique you see in front of me now. I was still as skinny as a rail at this point in time. And so I know I wasn't intimidating anyone. But this guy, in 2 years' time, he had really changed. And he wasn't fat. I mean, this guy was he was a big guy, a lot different than he was 2 years earlier. And he come right up to me and was doing one of those things where he was shoving his finger right in my chest. And he was saying, "You and me, one-on-one, make it, take it. The winner gets to beat the snot out of the other one." And he didn't have a smirk or anything on his face. And so things backed off. Even my 2 friends backed off to the side, you know. And he's asking for a ball, and he's wanting to play. And I'm just like, I know this is a lose-lose proposition, because I really did think I could take him at a game of basketball, but I thought, you know, the end result could be a whole lot worse if I end up doing that. And I honestly don't really remember how that whole thing played out. I do know that I didn't have a black eye. My nose was still intact and everything, you know, when we went home later that night. Somehow I was able to stall and talk our way out of it and everything. And there didn't end up being a fight. But I want to tell you this. My heart was just racing at that moment, because I really thought, he can do it. What he said he could do. He can do it. You know, and I felt like I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I remember the emotion of that moment that was just surging through me. Well, I say all that to say this. That is not even close to what was playing out with Jesus. When Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was there with his disciples, and he had gone over there for the purpose of prayer. And then this big mob shows up with Judas. Jesus didn't have those kinds of emotions. Jesus didn't have that kind of a panicky feeling going through him on this occasion. In fact, the truth of the matter is, Jesus was in full control of the situation. See, I wasn't in any control whatsoever. But Jesus was in full control the entire time. So if you have looked at the story leading up to the crucifixion of Christ, and in particular this passage, if you have looked at all of this and envisioned Jesus, thought of him as being a helpless victim in the face of an angry mob, then I'm going to ask you to rethink that. Okay? Rebuild that understanding of this story, because that's not accurate. Remember how Peter talked about all this stuff that Jesus went through? Although for Peter it was like 50 days later he was talking about it. In Acts chapter 2, he gives us some insight. He says this, "Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man," now he's talking about Jesus, and get this phrase, "this man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge." Boy, that's key. This man, he's talking about Jesus. And he's talking about his crucifixion and everything. And of course, he's eventually going to start talking about his resurrection in the context. But specifically now he's referring to his crucifixion. Okay, said, "This man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross." Yeah, Jesus went into this whole thing with his eyes wide open. He knew full well what was about to play out. And I want to show you how convincing it is that that indeed is true. So let's look at this passage in John chapter 18 a little closer, and let's see for ourselves how this arrest is different than any other arrest you have ever heard of. How the one being arrested here, namely Jesus, in this situation is ultimately the one who is in charge. Yeah. So let's analyze it. First of all, notice his decision. Verses 1 and 2, and again, those verses say this. After Jesus had said these things, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden. And he and his disciples went into it. Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. This is all happening right after the Last Supper. You remember the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. That was right before the Last Supper. That's recorded in John 13. I mean, all of that stuff was happening this very evening. And Jesus also had spent some lengthy time in prayer. The longest recorded prayer of Jesus that is found in the Bible is the preceding chapter in John. So that and the supper and the washing of feet and all of that had just got done playing out. And now Jesus takes his disciples across the Kidron Valley into the Garden of Gethsemane. And yeah, this is the occasion where Jesus takes a couple of them a little further than the rest, and then he breaks away from them and spends time in prayer, and he comes back and finds them sleeping. And then he goes back praying, comes back and finds them sleeping. You remember that story, that yeah, this is the occasion that all of that played out. But the thing that I want you to notice in particular is look in verse 2. It says regarding Judas, it says, Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. The point is, Judas knew Jesus was going to be there. He knew it. Now, when Jesus had that lengthy prayer that's recorded in John 17 and said, let's go, guys, let's go pray, go across the Kidron Valley, Judas wasn't with them then. But Judas knew this is where he could find Jesus, because it was a rather habitual thing on Jesus' part that he liked to end the day when he was around Jerusalem by going into the garden and spending some time in prayer. And so in that sense, Jesus was predictable. And so Judas knew that that was where he could find him. And the thing I want you to notice in particular is that there was no attempt on Jesus' part to avoid Judas. Even though he knew full well what was about to play out, there was no attempt on his part to avoid him and what he was about to do. Remember when Jesus had got done washing the disciples' feet, and during the Last Supper, toward the end of the Last Supper, Jesus had a little exchange with Judas when Judas left the group. And that's recorded in John 13, verse 27. It says, as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. What you are about to do, do quickly, Jesus told him. But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. You see, Judas was in charge of the group treasury. He was the money bag holder. And so some of them just figured, well, Jesus gave him some instructions to go out and buy some more supplies, maybe some more food or whatever the case might be. But instead, Jesus was talking about something entirely different to Judas, and Judas knew it. And Jesus knew it as well. He said, what you're about to do quickly. Now, if you knew that something bad was going to happen at a certain place, wouldn't you try to avoid that place? I mean, had I known that back in 1976, going to that community center with my two buddies, if I had known what was going to play out there, don't you think I would have avoided going there? Absolutely. I mean, that's the sort of thing that it just makes sense. But that's true if you don't want what's about to happen to happen. Jesus knew this needed to happen. And so he did not rearrange his plans. Though Judas was the one that made the decision to betray him and to strike up this deal with the authorities, Jesus was not going to change his plans because he knew this needed to happen. There's something else I want you to notice in this passage. I want you to notice his demeanor. Verses 3 and 4 says, so Jesus took a company of soldiers and some temple police from the chief priests and the Pharisees and came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen to him, went out and said to them, who is it that you're looking for? It's pretty apparent that those that went after Jesus with Judas, that they were fully expecting that Jesus was not going to be cooperative. It's pretty obvious in this passage of Scripture that that is the case. They expected typical human behavior from Jesus. And what would typical human behavior be when a mob is coming to get a guy like this? Well, typical human behavior was fight or flight. I mean, and they expected either of those to happen, and they were prepared for either of those to happen. It says that in their number of the mob that came, there was a detachment of soldiers. Some translations use the word cohort. Now, based on what that word means and the way that it was used among the Romans, is that was several hundred strong. And even taking a conservative note, I noticed this week when I researched that additionally, that most Bible scholars, they end up settling somewhere around 600 in number. And that's not even a complete cohort. Now, generally speaking, there weren't that many Roman soldiers around Jerusalem. Now, around Caesarea, you would find that many Roman soldiers, but that was kind of a headquarters, so to speak, for the Romans. But this was Passover weekend. And so they knew that on this religious holiday, there was going to be floods of people that would be coming into Jerusalem. And so, yeah, the Romans, they would dispatch extra soldiers to go somewhere just for riot control, if nothing else. And so there were a lot more Roman soldiers available. And through their connections and all, some of the people that Judas was dealing with, they were able to get a cohort of soldiers to go along with them. It also specifically says in the text that they were carrying weapons with them. You see, they anticipated potential resistance from Jesus and his clan, the guys that he hung out with. And so they had guys that had their own weapons in this mob that were coming. However, at the same time, they thought that the possibility might be true that Jesus would be going into hiding and he would be hard to get, that he'd be running or hiding or something along those lines. And so it says specifically in the text that they brought with them lanterns and torches. Now, here's the significant thing about that, is that the Passover feast was happening during a full moon. So there was plenty of light. I mean, you could see pretty well in a full moon. But they anticipated that Jesus might be hiding. He might be hiding behind some rocks or in a group of trees or in a cave or something like that. And so to be able to find him, they foresaw that they might need some additional light to accomplish that. So here they are. They arrive on the scene in verse 4, but it becomes quickly apparent that Jesus is not hiding like Saddam Hussein did a number of years ago in a hole in the ground. Jesus isn't pulling one of those. Rather, instead, Jesus walks right up to them as they approach in the garden. This shatters all of their assumptions. Jesus initiates contact. Yeah, so I say, take note of that, his demeanor in this. Another thing I want you to notice in the passage is to notice his power. Verses 5 and 6 read this way, right after Jesus asked the question, who is it you're looking for? Verse 5 says, Jesus the Nazarene, they said. I am he, Jesus told them. Judas, who betrayed them, was also standing with them. When Jesus told them, I am he, they stepped back and fell to the ground. I mean, look what happens when Jesus says, I am he. He says, I am he. They're asking for Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus says, I am he. They take a step back, and whether all of them or a bunch of them fall to the ground. Now, I would say that's a bit unusual. That's kind of a strange reaction, especially when you remember that these are the guys who are armed. Jesus isn't armed. Obviously, there must be more to this than meets the eye. And indeed, there is. When Jesus says, I am he, what he is actually saying in the Greek, and some of you maybe have a translation that brackets words that get inserted to the text just to help with understanding. Not all translations do that. In fact, most translations don't do that, but a few do that. Well, this is one of those examples where there would be a word in that answer that would be bracketed. It would be the word he. When they were saying that they were looking for Jesus the Nazarene, Jesus' response, literally, that's in the Greek, is, I am. His response was, Yahweh. Yeah, and we quickly recognize that, not only because it was found earlier, like in the book of John, you know, there were a couple of incidences where Jesus said something very similar and got quite a reaction from people. But when you study in the Bible at even earlier places, the first place you see it is way back during the days of Moses in Exodus chapter 3, the burning bush. And when Moses asked, what is your name? And God responded, I am. I am that I am. Yeah, this was the special name of God. It means that God has no past and God has no future, only an eternal present. He is who he is. He has always been who he is, and he will always be who he is. I am. And when they asked, or when they stated, we're looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, Jesus' response, I am. And people started falling down, backing off and falling as a result. If Jesus had that kind of authority and he had that kind of power, the ability to speak a word and to knock people to the ground, then clearly he did not need to surrender to them. He did not have to surrender to them. But John points this out for us so that we will know beyond any doubt that Jesus was in control of this situation. They weren't taking his life. He was giving his life. There's a major difference there. Another demonstration of his power is a little bit later in the text, verses 10 and 11, where it says, Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave, cut off his right ear. His name was Malchus. At that, Jesus said to Peter, Sheathe your sword. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me? Now, Peter pulls out his knife, what I refer to as a pocket knife. He pulls it out, and he starts swinging away. And he makes contact with one of the people there. And Jesus immediately jumps on top of that and just saying, Peter, put that knife away. Put your pocket knife away. That's not needed. That wasn't the only thing that Jesus said. And this is one of the beauties of Bible study. When you study the Bible, you don't just take one passage and focus your attention just on that passage and try to arrive at conclusions and insight just in what you see in that passage, but you allow other scriptures in the Bible to shed insight into it. And so in a case like this, as we're reading about Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, we take a look in the other gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Do any of them talk about this same occasion? And sure enough, they do. And so we're able to get additional insight into how all of this played out. And one of the things that Matthew adds, that not only did Jesus say to Peter, put that knife away, but Jesus said something else too. And it's recorded in Matthew 26, verse 53, where he says to Peter, Or do you think that I cannot call on my Father, and he'll provide me at once with more than 12 legions of angels? Again, a military designation the Romans were known to use, legion. A legion represented 6,000 soldiers. And so basically what Jesus is saying here is like, Peter, put your knife away. Don't you know I can call upon my Father and he'll dispatch 72,000 angels? Now, based on our understanding of what we read in the Old Testament, in particular, there's one story that talks about how one angel was able to destroy 185,000 soldiers. 185,000 soldiers, one angel. And so one angel could easily handle this mob that came to arrest Jesus. But Jesus says, hey, all I got to do is say the word, and 72,000 angels are going to be here at this moment to deliver me from this. But again, Jesus knew it wasn't for him to be delivered from this. And it's at that time he reached out his hand. According to Luke's gospel, Luke 22, verse 51, he reached out his hand and he healed Malchus's ear. It's at this point, moving forward, that things really begin accelerating. Most of us are at least fairly familiar with what happens next. After they've arrested Jesus, they take him off, and a series of mock trials take place. And I use the phrase mock trials because basically they were just throwing all kinds of stuff and accusations at him, just hoping something would stick that would help justify what they already planned to do to Jesus. And so there were all kinds of accusations and stuff thrown his way, and eventually they were able to come up with a couple of things that seemed to stick and justify the course of events in their own minds. And so it started, the flogging. the crown of thorns and all of this. A flogging, now we know back in the Old Testament law, states that when someone would be whipped, the limitation was to be 40 lashes, and that was it. And so it kind of became a tradition, 40 minus 1. That way you wouldn't flirt with the line and accidentally give one too many whips, so they would whip. A Jewish whipping would include 39. But you got to remember, they weren't the ones doing the whipping here. It was the Romans. And their hands weren't tied to the number 40. So who knows how many times Jesus actually was whipped. It would have been a cat of nine tails, several strands of leather tied with pieces of metal and pieces of bone, and the intent there was to both bruise and rip. Bruise, cut, and rip into a person's flesh. It was known that sometimes a person that was flogged died from the flogging alone. They didn't even live long enough to be crucified. In Jesus' case, he did survive that. I'm not sure by how much, but he did survive it. He stumbled under the weight of the cross, had to have some help in carrying that, and then he was crucified. And then he was buried. Here's the thing I want to make sure you get out of all of this. In fact, it's a big part of what John wants us to understand, and it's this. Jesus was not taken against his will. Okay? If you haven't grasped that and understood that so far, then you haven't accurately understood this whole storyline of what played out in those final couple of days. Jesus was not taken against his will. In addition to everything I've already talked about that helps support that particular comment, look again at verse 4 in our text. It seems to be rather crystal clear. It says, "Then Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen to him." He knew everything that was going to play out. And that's not just talking about his arrest. He knew everything that was going to happen. And yet he allowed it to happen. Now the disciples, they didn't see it. I mean, they just saw it as being Judas. I mean, they were confused about Judas's role in it, but they saw it as being a mad mob that was out to arrest Jesus and do him in because they were threatened and jealous by him and what all. And that's the way they saw it. But appearances can be kind of deceiving, because the thing here is Jesus was in control the whole time. Like I said earlier, they weren't taking his life. Jesus was giving his life. He could have stepped out of that whole sequence of events at any moment in time, but he didn't. What was happening because it needed to happen. Jesus wasn't tricked. Jesus wasn't trapped. The truth of the matter is, the reason Jesus was born to begin with was for this very moment. Jesus was born to die. And that was a part of the plan from the beginning. Listen to what Jesus said right before the washing of the feet, the Last Supper, all of that stuff starts happening in John chapter 13, and leading up to this particular moment, the second half of that final full day of Jesus' life. Look at and listen to what Jesus said in John chapter 12, verse 27, and this, by the way, is your memory verse for this week. Jesus said this to his disciples: "Now my soul is troubled. What should I say? Father, save me from this hour? But that is why I came to this hour." All the dots are connecting in our minds. Now we're seeing even in a fuller way. Jesus went into this, and he went through all of this with his eyes wide open. This is why in those closing moments of Jesus' life, after the flogging, after the crucifixion, while he was hanging and bleeding there on the cross, Jesus said in his final breath, he said these words that are recorded by John in chapter 19, verse 30. He said, "It is finished." And then bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. It is finished. That's actually one word in the Greek. of what he was stating. And according to Luke chapter 23, verse 46, he was saying this in a loud voice. He wasn't whispering it. He was shouting it, at least as much as he could shout it in the condition that he was in. It is finished. It wasn't a cry of defeat. Now, this was more of a cry of victory. It was a cry of accomplishment. Think along the lines of the phrase, mission accomplished. And I think you'll be headed the right direction in the way that particular word was used in Jewish culture back at that time. It's been completed. That's what he was saying in that final breath right before he died. And it wasn't by coincidence. At that very moment, something else happened. At that very moment, again, using parallel gospel accounts to flesh out the whole story, we find this in Matthew chapter 27, verse 50. When Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Last Sunday on the connection card, I had a question that was worded this way: what's the most dramatic part that led up to the resurrection of Jesus? And I asked that question just because I was kind of at a lack for another question. So I thought, well, that's a good question, and I didn't really think that I would be drawing any conclusions from it, because I figured that pretty much any answer people give are going to be good answers to this, because there were a lot of things that led up to the resurrection of Christ that had significance, great significance. But here's the interesting thing, that when the results were tallied up and everything, the number one answer that was given by people here in the church to the question, what's the most dramatic part that led up to the resurrection of Jesus? The number one answer that was given, the tearing of the veil from top to bottom. At first when I saw that, I just saw that as a point of interest. But then as I was sitting down and writing the message, it just smacked me right between the eyes. How huge that really is, because of everything it represented. This veil, it was huge, called a veil, called a curtain. It was in the temple, separating the holy from the holy of holies, and it was a huge thing. The Bible didn't give us all these dimensions on it, but this thing was like 4 inches thick. Don't think of a curtain like over your picture window in your house. This thing was 4 inches thick. It was 60 feet long. It was 30 feet high. According to the Jewish Talmud, it took 300 men to lift it up and put it into place. This thing was huge. It was massive. But even more significant is what it represented. It represented a barrier. Because you remember what was on the other side of this curtain. It was the Ark of the Covenant, where the top of the Ark of the Covenant was the mercy seat, where the presence of God dwelt. And only one person on one day of the year was ever allowed to pass through that curtain and to go into the Holy of Holies, into the presence of God. And that was the high priest on the Day of Atonement. But what this veil represented is it represented a barrier. People did not have access to God. And for good reason. God is holy and we're not. We're sinners. But from that day on, all temple ceremonies lost their significance. Yet for the next 40 years, the Levitical priests would continue to offer their sacrifices. They would continue to burn their incense and do all that. But it wasn't necessary anymore. Jesus had fulfilled his mission. I say 40 years because it was 40 years later the Romans totally destroyed the temple. But it wasn't necessary anymore. This is what Jesus came to do. That's why Jesus didn't run and hide when the mob came. This is why Jesus didn't call upon 72,000 angels to come and rescue him. This is why he told Peter, put away your knife. Is because he knew this needed to happen. Because by Jesus doing what he did, we have now been freed from our sin, and access to God has been restored. And that's what it was all about to begin with, was to pave a way for us to be able to be close to God and to have a relationship with God. That's what it was all about. That's why Jesus came, and that's why he didn't want anything hindering with his mission to make that ultimate sacrifice. Our ushers at this time are going to be getting up and preparing for our time of communion. And I hope that you, as well as I, understand that we have good reason to be thankful. Jesus wasn't in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jesus was exactly where he knew he needed to be in order to accomplish what he accomplished by voluntarily dying on our behalf. He didn't stay dead, and that's the good news, and that's what seals the victory, but that's next Sunday's subject. Okay? That's where we'll pick up next Sunday. But Jesus came deliberately, voluntarily, gave his life for us. It only stands to reason. If he gave his life for us, if he died for us, that the best way for us to respond is to live for him. And with that, let's pray. Father, thank you for helping us to appreciate better what we find recorded in the Bible. I thank you for your love and your devotion, your grace and your mercy, the compassion that caused you to do on our behalf the unthinkable in the sending of Jesus, and for him to voluntarily, deliberately offer up his life on our behalf, to take the penalty of our sin and to see that it was paid so we could be freed from that sin, and the way could be opened before us to a new life in Christ. Thank you, Father, for loving us more than we'll ever be able to comprehend during this lifetime.